is Kashif Powell, a fifth-year graduate student here at UNC Chapel Hill in the Communications Studies Department. And I have the pleasure of introducing our presenters for this, our first panel of the conference, Organizing Equality. So first up, we'll have from UNC Greensboro, Spoma, Jovanovic, and Ranata. And they'll be presenting Playing by the Numbers, challenges of equalizing power and the voice in a community organizing effort. Following them, we'll have Dean Mundy from Appalachian State University, and he'll be presenting on equality equals pride, the relationship between 21st century LBGT pride celebrations and the pursuit of full LGBT equality. And then finally, we'll have Elizabeth Jeter from the University of South Florida presenting on Building Coalition, examining relational equality in law enforcement and human trafficking training. So first up, Spoma and Ranata.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for being here. Okay, and I think I should say right off the bat that the goal here is to get you to organize a similar effort that we're going to talk about in your community. So that this is not a neutral presentation in the least. Okay, so we're going to start there. Okay. And just by way of introduction, I have been in Greensboro for the last 12 years in the department there, and been looking at community organizing efforts and the ways in which people come together to deliberate, dialogue, and create change. Much of that was focused on the efforts of the First Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the United States, and that was something that I followed for a lot of years. And out of that process emerged a number of other things, including the one we're going to talk about today. And Ranata, who is from Greensboro, started our graduate program last year and jumped in with us on this research. So we're really excited. And as you can see, no. So actually in May of 2011, we started in Greensboro to look at this concept called participatory budgeting. Like many great ideas in the world, this idea came from Latin America, where it had started in 1989 in Brazil. People had said, wow, we don't really have what we need here, and our government is not giving it to us. We need to be able to make decisions about how our tax dollars are spent. And so they started a process whereby people would come together, propose ideas, and then vote on them. Wow, concept about how they want their money spent. As you know, many of the things in our country are left, those kinds of decisions are left to our representatives. And so when this idea, it has just come to the United States. In 2009, Chicago was the first city to experiment with this on a very small scale. We were lucky in 2011 to hear from the organizers of this effort in Greensboro, and a core group of people said, we want to do this. We want to see if we can make this happen in Greensboro. Our research since then, has been funded in large part, by, I want to give a shout out to the Waterhouse Family Institute for the Study of Communication and Society, which looks particularly at issues of communication and social justice. And we were able to get a grant from Villanova University on that. And our main partner on this project is the Fund for Democratic Communities in Greensboro, which is actually a group that hands out money to other groups that are also doing work on social justice, although they haven't given us any money because we are us. Anyway, so there it is. So that's okay. That's okay. So for the last 2 years, really this is about, we don't have participatory budgeting in Greensboro, but what we have are people organizing to bring it forward. And so we're going to hear a little bit today about the outreach efforts as well as some of the internal struggles that have gone on to make this happen. Just to give you just a little bit of background, again, people come together, neighborhood assemblies, create proposals, come and vote, and then say, okay, government, now you make this happen. Because the government, of course, this is in actual cooperation with the government, has the resources to do things like make a dog park happen, or get solar lights or solar trash cans. These are the kinds of projects that sometimes people vote for that they want. Joe Moore was, as I said, the very first one in Chicago. He was the alderman there, like our city council people here, to say, why don't we try this? And he had been in office, this is interesting, for quite a while and thought he knew everything his constituents wanted. And he was shocked at the projects that they came up with. And they didn't want just streetlights and paving roads. And so they came up with some really innovative things. One of the beauties of participatory budgeting is that it really targets going out and getting voices of people not typically in our electoral process. So in Chicago, they allowed everybody who was the age of 16 and over to vote. You didn't have to be a citizen, you had to be a resident of the area. So that meant a lot of people who had not achieved citizen status, including Hispanic and Latinos, could vote in these elections for the things that they wanted. New York was the next one to try this, and actually, just to kind of give you an update where they are, 2 weeks, Chicago will be voting on their third one. They have about $5 million that they are now allocating to participatory budgeting. New York will also be voting shortly, and they have $10 million. It's expanded rapidly. San Francisco will be voting on a pilot project of $100,000 in, I think, May or June. And Vallejo, the city of Vallejo, is doing $3.2 million. They were the first city in the U.S., by the way, to go through bankruptcy, and so they're using participatory budgeting as a way to kind of say, maybe we need to invigorate our city a little bit and get some support. So, in looking at our literature, okay, so how does this relate to communication? I mean, I hope that's pretty obvious, and the voices that come forward. But we really recognize that, and I want, kind of tying into some of what, a little bit of, I guess you didn't use these words, Dennis Mumby's remarks earlier, but, we have this neoliberalism that's, kind of sweeping the psyche and the culture that really privileges very little, in terms of how we are to live our lives. And I think this is definitely a reaction to that, that we are noticing and seeing. And also, really, again, providing the opportunity for marginalized groups to participate fully. I know in Greensboro, one of the things that we're looking at is having not just participatory budgeting citywide, where everybody votes for everything, but rather by quadrants, because we know that there are some areas that are primarily African American, and if you throw it open to the whole thing, many of the projects that they want in their specific areas, in some economically depressed areas, probably wouldn't go. So we're going to try, I think the idea is to have 4 different little ones and some citywide projects in recognition of this particular issue. So for 2 years, as I said, we've been, I would call ourselves communication activists. We are not just recording the process, we are intervening, we are trying to make it happen. We want you to go do this. Okay, oh, I said that. We've actually collected 111 surveys from a number of public presentations out in the community where we'd spend an hour and kind of take people through the process, let them dream about what are the things they think should be done. And I want to tell you, one of the projects that came through was with students. Well, we want downtown, this might resonate with you. We want downtown parking free for students, a downtown parking lot. Well, and I know, in fact, I giggled. I said, oh, this is very funny. Well, we presented this, the research that we had collected, by the way, through our field notes and the surveys, we actually presented to the mayor and the city, some of the members of the city council in December with the organizers. And the mayor said, that's not so funny. In fact, we do want a downtown campus, and I actually think we will have a parking lot, and it will be free for students. And so you see how these things start to converge, and it actually gets pretty exciting. I started to count, and I can't, but the notebooks full of field notes, I don't know, it would be impressive. 300, 400, 500, 600 pages of field notes, as well as about 70 hours attending at planning meetings over the last couple of years. So we're very excited to be part of this. I'm going to turn it over to Renata and let her give you the lion's share of what we've found.
Okay, so Greensboro residents and PB. So like Spoma said earlier, we reached out to a lot of diverse groups across the community because we wanted everyone's voices included. So we did 20 presentations to Occupy, neighborhood associations, democratic groups, college students, university learning communities, homeless advocates. So pretty much every demographic of people we tried to reach during the PB presentations and mock PB processes. So what are good PB processes? So these are the types of projects that came out when Greensboro residents were allowed to dream about what they wanted for their city. So the projects that came out were heart fairs for the low income, traditional assistance, community gardens, children after school services, barbecue grills, outdoor cinemas, solar powered street lights, bus benches and shelters, downtown businesses, student only parking, and an increase in policing. So you will see that there. From our research, we pulled out the themes of power and voice. So power within the group, with elected city leaders, and with other community organizations. So basically, participatory budgeting is an open democratic process that promotes traditional forms of order within established democratic systems. So because we saw manifestations of tensions within the organizing groups as an alternative structure model and focusing on individual gifts. So I will account of group tension from a qualitative interview. PBGSO also became bogged down in internal process, how to make decisions, who can do what task, which left us ineffectual at even having productive meetings, never mind campaigning for PB. Here, absence of power in the form of roles within the organizing group in an attempt to have a process absence of power left some group members frustrated and feeling a sense of ineffectiveness. So, kind of following this, the organizing group decided to implement structure. So structures, roles, and committees were implemented within the PB organizing group on a 3-month system. So this 3-month system intentionally allows new people to come in and contribute so power doesn't get bogged down within one person, but rather it's a cyclical, and implementation of these roles are observed with the increased group members, group involvement, and new people to the group. So all members of PBGSO are allowed to contribute at all levels in the organizing process. So actually a group of students from the Greensboro colleges and university came up with the mock PB process. So everyone's allowed to contribute, and the 3-month implementation system that we are currently following was suggested by a first-time member of a PB, of someone coming to the PB group. So all communication interaction with the elected city leaders are influenced by some form of traditional power. So during an interview, a group member pointed out that having an outside expert from the participatory budgeting project in New York is what gave the group some leeway with the city council. He recounted that I think that the turning point was when we got Josh Werner to come and meet with the city council members. That seems to have been a catalyst for progress with them. So before, the city council just interacted with the PB organizing group, but when an outside source, which had some kind of traditional connections with power, came in, that kind of changed the trajectory that the group was taking, and the city council kind of started taking this idea more seriously and heavily started considering PB in Greensboro. So with other community organizations, PB is all about people. PB is a people process. So the goal of PBGSO was to outreach and to include as much people as possible in the organizing process. From field notes from the organizer, they said that they needed endorsement from CEJ, the NAACP, neighborhood associations, that we could no longer be random. Who do we need to influence? Who do we need to sit down with? Whom do we need to persuade? Then I think we'll have enough pressure for the city council. So community organizing was done as a way to get support from the city council, so power within the people, power within the group, so the collective organizing of community organizations would then get the power transferred to the people so the city council could listen and then take this process seriously. Next will be activating agency, but the slide isn't moving, so I'll just start talking about it. Okay, so currently our society has seen a decline in group process. So Hessel and Morin in A Path to Hope say the glittering success of individualism has brought with it the miserable deterioration of fellowship. PBGSO projects itself through its promotional material as one with the community while placing emphasis on an individual's ability to make decisions at the city level. So in their promotional material, it's all about the community. It's our city, our money, our choice. That's their promotional line. Participatory budgeting gives ordinary people real decision-making power in order to make their city a better place to live. So again, the emphasis is placed on the individual, and they're activating their agency to make decisions about their tax dollars and what they can contribute to their society versus a top-down process of the city council saying, okay, this is what we think you need. But no, it's engaging residents to say, okay, this is what we feel that we need. Representation, oh, here it is. Okay, PB represents itself as an open model for participatory democracy, and it centers itself on open, deliberative, and diverse practices through their internal structures and external outreach. So this includes a 3-month rotation and outreach to different demographics of groups that they are trying to get included in the process. Okay, I'm going to read this. This is a field note that just kind of outlines this, so follow along with me. Contributor 1. My idea was that you do need a group of people who take the main level of responsibility and assign responsibilities, otherwise you don't get anything done. If we don't decide to be the steering committee and to set goals and strategies, I don't know who will. I don't think we need to be close-minded, but if you don't have someone to convene a meeting or make sure some things get done, nothing gets done. Contributor 2. If you want PB, we should hold ourselves to the same standard others will need to abide for PB. Contributor 3. As I begin to think about process, I like the idea of thinking of ourselves as organizers. Steering committee is the wrong name. Organizers also lift up the veracity of the group. While we may not always need to vote, it may be apparent that 1, 2, or 3 might say we need more time to think about this. The end result is not to walk away from the process, but instead build the strength of the group and build the relationships we need. Voting can get a little harsh. I don't think we need the resolution of a vote. I think we're moving in the direction of coming to consensus. Contributor 4. This is a conversation within an organizing group meeting. The internal organization can be an exact mirror of what we want. The better we build this, the better the process for PB will be. The more we play a participatory, the deeper our roots will be. Consensus allows for collaboration. Everyone is invested in it, and we can be fluid. There might be some procedures that require some voting, but in the first parts, to dive into participatory, it is important to be able to communicate with the wider public. So this example is, yes, 1 minute. Okay. So that example, as I finished, was kind of a culmination of everything with voice and power within the internal organizing group. So how do we internally organize ourselves to reflect like power and organizing as necessary? And then how do we ourselves promote deliberation, dialogue, and collaboration within ourselves as we want to be a model process if we're trying to implement that at a citywide level? Thank you.
Next we'll hear from B.
Try hitting escape. It's probably gonna, seems like it's just going slow. I think it's still working.
Okay. How's everybody doing?
See what happens when you go out.
I know, exactly. Now this computer. Oh,
This is slow.
All right, so
Do you have anything else running?
Most likely. It's a PC.
maybe I should try to reboot it.
Did it close it?
I can try to open it. There we go. All right, can y'all see that?
Yeah.
It's like okay. There we go. All right, how's everybody doing today? Sorry about that.
Good.
So I'm Mundy. I'm an Appalachian State. I'm glad to be back. I have all my degrees from UNC, so every time I have an opportunity to go back to Chapel Hill, I do. And actually, y'all are somewhat of guinea pigs in two respects. This is new research for me that I'm still trying out and trying to see sort of where it fits. I'm also sort of obsessed right now with infographics. Do y'all know infographics? They're like the long online poster things. I'm making all of my students do them left or right. I think the entire world's like an infographic right now. So this is my attempt at doing an infographic as well, so bear with me. This project that I'm presenting today, and I apologize because I have a bit of a cold, I'm still getting over it. This project is part of a bigger project. I'm coming from the mass comm perspective, from the public relations side, and I did this bigger project where I'm looking at how are these gay pride, is everybody familiar with gay pride? Sort of the idea of gay pride, the big celebrations everywhere. I wanted to see how do today's 21st century pride celebrations, how do they execute, how do they organize their events from a public relations perspective? I mean, what is the planning process? What is the communication process? What technologies do they use? But when I was going through all my findings, I sort of uncovered this other element that really I thought spoke to the mission of this conference in terms of the idea of mainstream. One of the questions that I asked people was, talk to me about this mainstream question in the 21st century. So to back up a little bit, to give you a little bit of history for those of you who are not familiar with the history of Pride. Pride basically started in 1969, and that's the top left picture there, at the Stonewall Inn. The police in New York and Greenwich Village raided this bar. It was a gay bar. It was called the Stonewall Inn, and for the first time, the patrons of this bar sort of stood up, retaliated, fought back, and said, no, you can't do this. It turned into like a 3 or 4 day riot in Greenwich Village outside of the bar on Christopher Street, which is the name of the street that the bar was on. And it sort of grew and grew. And then in the first year, in the first anniversary of the Stonewall riots, which they became known as, some cities started sort of celebrating and honoring those riots. In New York and in LA, LA's pride organization is actually called Christopher Street West to sort of honor what happened in New York. Since that time, today, there are more than 75 prides in the United States. And I would say it's probably even bigger than that in terms of major prides. There are more than 75 prides. There are 35 in the UK alone, 50 in the rest of Europe, several in South America, including Sao Paulo, Brazil, which has the Guinness Book of World Record of Pride attendees, which is like more than 3 million attendees every year. These have become massive, massive, massive events. And growing from like the handful of people who rioted that first day in 1969. So the question that I pulled for this research was, all right, so things have grown over the last 40 plus years, almost 45 years. It's a much different type of event than it was in 1969, 1970, 1971. And there's this question of difference versus assimilation. So as the LGBT community, or actually as the gay community sort of became the LGBT community, as we started adding, sort of embracing identities within the broader community, we started receiving more acceptance, and of course there's been a lot of progress. And so my question was, what does Pride communicate in the 21st century? What is, in this bigger march toward full equality, what is the role of Pride? And what is sort of the balance between communicating difference and communicating sort of messages of assimilation? Certainly it's not the protest, riot-focused voice that it was in 1969, but there's still something there. So, I gotta scroll. So my research basically wanted to sort of pick, this isn't working. So basically, this is what I was just talking about. This is how we've grown over the last, say 40 years. It was the gay community originally. Now it's the lesbian community, gay men, transgender, bisexuals, LGBT allies, ally organizations. It's sort of grown. LGBT youth is a new focus. LGBT seniors are a new focus. In addition, compared to where we were in Stonewall, we've got city governments we interact with, celebrities want to be part of these events, mainstream media want to cover these events. Of course, independent media want to cover them as well. Religious leaders, religious organizations, politicians, local citizens, the community itself, vendors, sponsors. It's a huge, huge sort of network of a lot of different stakeholders. And so, sort of, what is the goal? What is the mission of these events? So what I did was I interviewed leaders from major pride celebrations across the country. I actually reached out for about 20 major pride celebrations to see how many people I could get to participate. And I ended up interviewing the executive directors of 10 major pride celebrations in the United States. As you'll see on the left-hand side, Boston, Charlotte, Denver, Indianapolis, LA, Miami, New York City, Philly, Portland, and DC. And I was particularly happy to get New York City's participation because of their history, because they were basically the start of Pride, and also LA's participation because they were the second oldest Pride, and then Boston as well, just sort of to get the big representatives. So I was glad to get somewhat of a national sample in terms of Pride celebrations. Together, these executive directors are in charge of hosting events that collectively have about 4 million people come to them annually. So it's grown substantially, and they kept saying, they're like, these things keep growing, we can't keep up. And so it's a huge challenge. And so basically one of my questions was, are Pride celebrations becoming mainstream? And if so, what does that mean for this overall movement? And it was interesting in terms of the mainstream question, and actually I tripped up every single time I asked it. I didn't know how to ask it. How do you say, are we mainstream? Is that good? Is that not good? What is the definition of mainstream? How do we define that? And it was interesting because there were consistent responses across all 10 cities. And there are three major themes that sort of emerged in response to this question. Number one, everybody was like, well, we all know that today's events are family events. That this is our community, that we are families. The head of Philly Pride, for example, said, everybody sort of respects this as a family event. My kids are 18 to 22. When I started, they were 4 and 6. I wanted this to be a family event. I wanted to be able to bring my kids to it. And everybody said that. In Denver, they've actually added a day to their Pride celebration that's called Family Day. And it is completely focused on bringing families, having a family picnic. Boston has a family picnic. Most cities have a huge family component to it. And they're like, that is what we need to communicate in terms of this broader mainstream question, and we need to actually embrace that. Part of that, I said, so where does this leave us? Where is this sort of pulling us? And everybody said, this is becoming a culture movement. It's not necessarily still an LGBT movement the way it was even 10 years ago. It is a culture movement. And we need to start looking at these things as if it's like the Jewish celebration or a Scottish celebration, like St. Patrick's Day celebration. Boston, their big claim to fame is that the Gay Pride Parade is now larger than their St. Patrick's Day Parade, which is huge for the Boston community. It's a huge Irish American population. And so they all said that we need to celebrate this as a culture. This is what we are, we're just a different culture. They have all these different types of cultural celebrations, and that's what we need to see these as. And I thought that was sort of interesting too. And I was like, well, where's this protest voice? But they didn't really seem to really worry about that one as much. So I then followed up and I would ask, what does that mean for diversity? If we're becoming this cultural movement, if we're sort of becoming just like all these other cultural celebrations, and if we're focusing on family and showing our normalcy of family in these events, what does that say for diversity? And everybody said, actually, it means that we need to really, really communicate diversity, and how diversity is a mainstream value, and how the more diverse you are, the more you are reflecting the broader mainstream. And I love the Boston participant because she said, it's fine to be an LGBT American, and we need to embrace that. But we need to sort of hold on to that and maintain our cultural identity. And she actually compared it to immigration. She was like, the question and the challenge facing the LGBT community, especially in the context of Pride going forward, is think about an immigrant family. She was like, if some girl was being raised in a family, like an Italian-American family, and she forgets a recipe that her grandmother told her, that taught her. It is her responsibility and the family's responsibility to say, hey, that's important for our tradition. That's important for who we were and who we are as Italian Americans. And so it's up to them to sort of hold on to that. And so the head of Boston's Pride said the same thing for us. They're like, this is important for us to become part of this larger tapestry and to communicate the importance of diversity. But in that broader landscape, the challenge is, how do we hold on to those cultures, traditions that are unique to the LGBT community? And actually, I had about half of my participants said the biggest challenge is LGBT youth, who don't know the history of Stonewall, don't know why Pride exists at all. So how do we educate them to sort of maintain that cultural difference in this broader landscape. The bigger ideas then, I pulled these other two quotes in that were consistent across all of the participants. Most people said, well, our issues are mainstream issues. Like I said, that the idea of diversity is a mainstream issue, and that's what we need to communicate. We actually need to go sort of all in, is what people said, in terms of the importance of this infinite diversity. In Philly, and a few people echoed this as well, he said the LGBT community is not particularly radical. We're not radical. We're really boring people, is what a lot of people said. We're just very corporate, very, mainstream, actually they would use the term. And a lot of people said, I wish we were more radical. What's going to happen to that protest-focused voice that still needs to be a part of it, given these broader, more important 21st century missions? And so those were consistent. And so I started thinking, well, where does this leave us? And I started thinking of two of my favorite quotes from actually almost 20 years ago that really sort of directly challenged the gay community, the LGBT community, to figure out sort of where is pride. And I thought, okay, these are questions posed 20 years ago, or almost 20 years ago. How can we sort of readdress that? Epstein in '94 said, queer politics raises perplexing questions about the relations between identity and action. And so we're coming from the queer theory perspective of all identity is fluid, all identity is sort of unstable, so how can you actually, sort of try to classify an identity because it is so fluid? You can't sort of, pinpoint a concrete identity. Gampson said, if identities are indeed much more unstable, fluid, and constructed than movements have tended to assume, if one takes this queer challenge seriously, where does that leave us in terms of identity-based social movements such as the gay and lesbian rights movement? And so I thought about these quotes and I tried to return to the findings to see, okay, so what would be the answer? And this is where I'm trying out sort of my ideas and sort of how can we couch this in the idea of queer theory, is I started thinking, is the question actually the answer? And I know that doesn't really make too much sense, but only by directing and embracing difference in the fluidity and instability of individual identity can we honestly pursue equality, while perhaps resolving this dilemma by actually going all in and saying, okay, we need to actually communicate the infinity of diversity. And by doing that, then maybe we can actually sort of start responding to the premise of queer theory in terms of the importance of difference. And so I actually came out of here with some new questions. Is there any more in terms of the LGBT community? How do we define the external perspective? If we go back to the earlier part of the presentation where I was talking about all the different stakeholders, the city government, the celebrities, the corporations, all the different communities, and everybody is part of these events, what's external and what's internal? And is that dichotomy important anymore when you're talking about this broader movement and the broader mandate of 21st century, LGBT equality? And then this is a bit more fuzzy. I started saying, okay, so if we're talking about the instability of identity, is what they're trying to communicate actually the stability of difference? In terms of everybody's difference, this is the one stable thing, is that everybody is absolutely different and identity is unstable. And so does the instability of identity actually equate to the stability of difference in the eyes of these organizations? And does this sort of suggest some kind of uniform fluidity? I mean, it's not this, in the eyes of my participants, it's not as much of an unwieldy concept anymore if you really do sort of go all in terms of the idea of diversity. And so that's where I left it, and oops, my computer just went off here. But I have the citations at the bottom. But those were the final questions I had in terms of, I thought it was a very interesting sort of conversation that I was the one hesitating in terms of the idea of mainstream. How do I ask it? What do I need to provide in terms of the context? And they never hesitated. And all the participants were like, oh no, let's talk about the mainstream question because it's important and we are mainstream. And here's how we have to see it in the 21st century. So thank you.
Finally, we'll go from Elizabeth.
Let's see. We can turn on all the lights and get rid of the screen. I'm by no means a Luddite, but I
Probably
do like
keep it on so that we can
presenting
keep it
without
working
all
for the next panel, but you can bring up the lights maybe. We'll see.
gigantic podium. It's a great physical barrier between speaker and audience. Sure. Just so enough. Oh, it's okay. Because we just made a point on it. Hello, my name is Elizabeth Peter. I'm from the University of South Florida. I too had my beginnings here. I was an undergraduate at UNC Chapel Hill in political science and history, and I was inspired to go into communication because of Rivka Eisner, who was an amazing PhD student here, and Della Pollock. So I wouldn't have gotten interested in communication if it wasn't for UNC Chapel Hill, so it's wonderful to be back. So my research specifically looks at coalition building and organizational change. So how organizations adapt to especially globalized issues of social justice and human rights. I look at human trafficking. It's an issue that has really come into prominence since like mid-1990s, but really with 2000, with the push with international and national laws against human trafficking. Oftentimes those laws frame human trafficking as the exploitation of labor through force, fraud, and coercion. So, and if you're familiar at all with a lot of mass media and popular culture images of human trafficking, it oftentimes is sex trafficking and deals with women, which kind of feeds into a lot of the stereotypes that we think of when we think of vulnerable populations. And so I like to look between this kind of bit larger discourse of human trafficking and actually the organizations themselves that are actually working against human trafficking and how they have to build coalition to accomplish its goal on a local level. My research specifically also looks a lot at Eisenberg and Eschenfelder, who actually use communication research as applied to go into organizations and communities and to actually use communication to make their processes of change and coalition building easier. So, from more of a theoretical standpoint, I'm really fascinated with the idea of putting communication at the center of organizing, so how communication actually functions so that we can enact change and build coalitions to fight against different social injustices. So I looked at Corin, specifically for how Corin uses narrative as a way of accessing coalition building through narrative. So how we tell our stories, how we use narrative to operationalize the link between sense-making processes and organizing. I decided to combine Corin with Mueller and Whistle, which are from developmental psychology, because they look at identity positioning within narratives, to then say, okay, within these organizational coalitions, how do we position ourselves among other partners and relationships to then question things like equality and also effectiveness. So how can we actually accomplish our goals? So my data and my methods, the research that I'm presenting today pulls from a small section of my dissertation research, which primarily focused on human trafficking training for law enforcement that was actually constructed by a larger statewide, a state within the southeastern part of the United States. But they put together a coalition of organizations everywhere from government officials to social service providers, religious organizations, law enforcement, and they put together a coalition that then built the training and then put the training into law enforcement yearly annual training. So I pulled both text from a variety of organizations as well as the training material, and then I also looked at the training sessions, about 14 hours. I had about 56 participants, and I also engaged them with surveys and interviews to really see how they were interpreting and negotiating this idea of who they are as officers and how they then relate to other members of coalitions to fight human trafficking. I found that the training session specifically created this amazing space in which you could negotiate the ideal that was often present in the more discourse level. So the mass media, the organizational discourse, and how you negotiate that on a local level within these training sessions. I found that two major narratives emerged that kind of acted in tension with each other. There was the victim-centered narrative, which was an ideal. it came from a lot of the text and the discourse that was available within the training. This put the victim at the center of the coalition. In other words, every organization looked to the victim to make sure that all of their efforts were trying to be as equal as possible, to get people out of servitude and empower them. Unfortunately, the narrative also included this idea that choice and agency for victims was kind of a circular path, where empowerment came through agency of choice, but choices were always limited by the institutions that were available to the victims. So visas, you had to help officers, you had to participate in the process to be able to get a visa. Without a visa, you couldn't work legitimately. So in that sense, you had power through choice, but choice was very limited. There was also the idea of heroes. The heroes, which you think would be the main center of the story, would be the victims themselves. But rather than the victims, the heroes became the organizations that were helping the victims. It became a moralistic tale, but then also encouraged organizations to participate. So the organizations also became heroes through acting upon the victims themselves. So how do you get them into the system and get them to agree to certain institutional claims of legitimacy, like visas, like choices of work, which then were also limited because depending on the victim's situation, they may not have the skills to enter the American workforce and get a job that would potentially support their life. So that became kind of a tension within the discourse itself. Another thing that was interesting was the idea of victimhood. So the victims themselves may not even be aware of their victimhood. So once again, it was important that the organizations themselves make the victims aware of this. And despite the claim that almost anyone could be a victim, that in many ways there are lots of vulnerable groups, women, children, but in the end, the idea of who was a victim within the narratives quite often came back to women, children, but also Latinas specifically, also some women from Eastern Bloc countries, as well as African American women, and it almost always centered on sex trafficking, which when you take the possibility of labor exploitation from a larger view, it can almost be in any industry. So then to have this kind of reinforcing of a narrative that focused on sex trafficking and different minority groups, you kind of limited who could potentially be helped by the systems and who could be identified as a victim. So what was interesting then was to take this kind of ideal and see how the officers and the training and the trainers, who were also officers themselves, oftentimes officers who were detectives and had kind of had that seasoned experience in the field, to be able to interpret the ideal, the discourse, for actual practical application by the officers themselves. So what was interesting is that even though the discussion centered on the idea of coalition, oftentimes it was just up to the individual officers themselves, really reinforcing an idealization of the individual as the center of agency. So these officers were expected to go out there and pretty much on their own fight human trafficking, which you can kind of imagine is a little difficult from a person's perspective of, how do I tackle this myself? So how they did that was the idea of organizations having different members that you can contact as an officer to then galvanize help. So if you're a male officer, which quite often the narratives themselves focused on kind of a male as the normal, and so then you were inspired to go and get help from, say, NGOs, who were oftentimes women, or female officers, to then help you with the victims. And your ultimate goal was always to essentially have a successful case that you would build and a successful prosecution, which in that sense, it kind of operationalizes the other coalition members simply for how they can help you get to that goal, which then questions the idea of who is actually equal in these relationships between the officers and NGO members, as well as other officers, as well as victims themselves. So, in that sense, you also had, so you had this kind of operation of, how can you use other coalition members, which is a very practical way of approaching it, but also problematic. Another thing that kind of became confusing was the idea of who is even a victim. Because the law enforcement officers had a hard time of pinpointing who's a victim. In media and in the discourse that was available for them in the training sessions, it was often quite clear, well, this is a victim, we must help them. But they also had the problem that many of, especially when it came to sex trafficking, they had always approached this group of people as criminals. So how do you reframe your approach to a particular group when you've constantly seen them as criminals? Same way with illegal immigrants. It's like, but they're illegal, they're criminals. We're supposed to see them as victims. And so this constantly came up in this kind of negotiation of the narratives themselves, and acted as a barrier for the officers to kind of see themselves as these active agents that are going to go out there and enact change and build coalition themselves. And so this also ended up leading most of the examples to sex trafficking specifically, because it was an area in which the officers could both galvanize support and potentially see human trafficking in their own community without actually diving into lots of the industries that are in their local communities that could have labor exploitation available. So as far as implications, one thing that I found interesting is that this gives us an opportunity to really examine how do organizations adapt and change and build coalitions to approach some of these more difficult issues that come along with globalization in our everyday lives, and also work towards human rights issues. Another thing that I found interesting is that it really raised questions about power relations within organizations and coalitions. And it also raised the question, do you need equality within these relationships? I mean, that was the ideal that was being produced by the discourse itself, but often these officers saw it that they could still accomplish the goal of getting victims to social service providers and prosecuting traffickers without necessarily having equality between their relationship to the victims themselves. So another thing that kind of that was represented within these two sides, both the ideal and the practical negotiation of the material, was also the idea of gender inequality. So because there was such a focus on sex trafficking and females, unfortunately that leaves out the idea of voices of victims that could be more diverse, and especially men, as well as boys. So it really makes a limited conversation on what's possible with identifying more variety of victims. And in this sense, it kind of reinforces Eisenberg's and Eschenfelder's claims that organizational coalition is difficult, especially when you're dealing with organizations that can have very diverse mission statements and purposes and goals, as well as cultures and identities. So what I found most interesting is what is the potential research in the future from the research that I conducted. There were narratives that weren't as frequent, but fascinating when they actually came up. So the idea of a dirty cop. The majority of the tales that were told were moralistic and only focused on cops as heroes, whereas some stories that kind of crept into the training kind of implicated that, well, this wouldn't be possible without a dirty cop that was helping it. Or there was a brothel in our town that worked with Latino organized crime, but it was only possible because of dirty cops. Another idea is the isolated officer. One of the interviews I conducted was with an officer who actually went through the training and then worked a human trafficking case himself, and he felt extremely isolated, that he could not do his job because there weren't those institutional support reinforcing, helping these officers, that too much of the responsibility was on them themselves to organize coalitions and to find help that they needed. Also, the lack of both men, people that were disabled, that are also vulnerable to human trafficking, homeless, and other populations that crept in through examples and stories within the training, but oftentimes were overlooked or ignored in the discussion. What I also find interesting is this kind of negotiation between these very global issues and how we approach them on the local level. So how do we begin to even